In this lesson, we discuss general global illumination settings in the global illumination rollout. This is the same scene from the lighting section when we were discussing skylight portal and IES lights. If I go to my render settings in the V-Ray tab and global switches rollout, as you can see, I have override material enabled, but I have excluded the chair, the lamp, and the curtains from the override. Also, I have two hidden spheres here. One of them is this reflective sphere, which has a reflective material applied to, and the other one is this refractive sphere, which has a transparent refractive material applied to. We'll be using them when the time comes. These spheres are also excluded from the override material. Now, let me show you a render of the scene with these current settings. So that is what we have right now. Let's get started with the parameters. In the GI tab and global illumination rollout, you can find some general settings that control different GI related things. Make sure the interface is set to expert so we can see all the options. First, we can enable and disable GI. Next, we can define our primary and secondary GI engines, obviously. Then we have two separate multipliers for the primary and secondary engines, and they determine the amount each one of these engines contribute to the overall illumination of the scene. The default of one is the physically accurate one, but you can adjust these multipliers if need be, which is not that often. Now, if I set the multiplier of my secondary engine to 0.5 and show you the resulting render, you can see the overall illumination gets darker compared to our previous render, and that might be what you want. But in most cases, as I mentioned, you need to leave these multipliers to 1 so you would get a physically accurate solution. Okay, let's set the secondary multiplier back to 1. Next, we have refractive and reflective GI caustics. When refractive GI caustics is enabled, indirect lighting can pass through the transparent or refractive objects and cause the caustics effect. Now, let me unhide this refractive sphere, which, as I mentioned, is transparent and has a transparent and refractive material applied to. In the first render, refractive GI caustics is disabled, and in the next render it's enabled, and you can clearly see the caustics effect caused by the transparent sphere. Now remember that this is an indirect caustics, and to get direct caustics we need to enable it from the caustics rollout down here. We'll be covering that later on. Next, we have reflective GI caustics, which if enabled allows the indirect light to reflect from the reflective surfaces, but unlike the refractive GI caustics, it's not contributing that much to the scene, so you can turn it off safely in most cases. In the scene, let's go ahead and hide the refractive sphere and unhide the reflective sphere. Now let me show you two renders with reflective caustics off and on. In the first one it's disabled, and in the next one it's enabled. I can barely see any difference. If I zoom in these kind of shadowy areas, you can see the enabled one is ever so slightly brighter, but really not that much. Now let's make sure reflective GI caustics is off. Next, we have saturation, which controls the color saturation in our GI solution. 1 is the normal value, 0 means no color, and anything more than 1 will result in more saturated colors. Now let's go over a few renders. In the first render, the saturation is set to 0. Also, I have just rendered the left side in the image so we can compare it easily with the normal saturation on the right side, and also to save some time. When the saturation is set to 0, you can see we have absolutely no color coming from the GI solution, only shades of gray. When the saturation is set to 1, we have a normal render, and when set to 2, the saturation is twice and we get more saturated colors from the GI solution. Let's make sure the saturation is set to 1 again. Next, we have contrast, which controls the overall contrast in our GI solution. Values less than 1 will make the GI to look more washed out, and values more than 1 will increase the contrast in GI. We have contrast base, which is the base for the contrast boost, and it determines the unchanged GI value based on which the contrast alters. Now let's go through some renders, and in these ones I also only rendered the left side. In the first render, the contrast is 0 and we get an absolutely uniform GI solution. If I go to the GI path, you can see that a bit better. Then the contrast was set to 1 and 2. And now, as you can notice, we have a lot more contrast. Let's set the contrast back to 1. Next, we have ambient occlusion, and if we enable it, we will be adding an ambient occlusion effect to the overall GI solution. Basically, ambient occlusion is a black and white map where the corners and closed surfaces are black and the flat areas are white. Now imagine multiplying that map over the image, so the corners and detailed areas are going to get darker. Now let's enable ambient occlusion. Here, first we have the value that controls the amount of ambient occlusion. So let me show you a few renders with different ambient occlusion values. In the first one, ambient occlusion is off. And in the next one, it is set to 0.8, which is the default value, and you can clearly see those darker details and corners. And in the next one, it is set to 2, and now it's a lot more obvious and exaggerated. Now in the next render, I set the ambient occlusion value to 0.2, and as you can see, it adds a lot more detail, but it's not unrealistic like the previous ones with the 0.8 or 2. And I usually don't use ambient occlusion, but if I happen to use it, I try to keep the value very low, because I think sometimes 0.2, 0.3 adds a lot, but without any negative effect on the realism of your image. Next, we have radius, which is the radius of the ambient occlusion. Here I have another render with the ambient occlusion set to 2 and radius set to 50. And as you can see, compared to this render with the value of 2 and radius of 10, the effect is a lot more spread. And the subdiv parameter, which controls the quality of the effect, and higher number result in less noise in the final render. So that's about general GI settings, and I will see you in the next lesson.